Resuming debate, the honourable member for Abbotsford.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And before I start, I want to indicate that I'm sharing my time with the member for Calgary-Nose Hill. And I've been looking forward to this debate, the Kinder Morgan pipeline debate, one that seems to be escalating Fed-Prov relations, especially between British Columbia and Alberta. So it's fair to ask, what is the Kinder Morgan pipeline? Well, there's an existing pipeline already from Alberta to the BC coast into Vancouver, which delivers crude oil for export abroad. And what this new proposal entails is simply running another line, for the most part parallel to the existing Kinder Morgan pipeline, and expanding the capacity effectively by tripling the amount of crude oil that makes its way to the West Coast. And of course, what it will do, it will displace oil that travels by truck or by rail. And I think if you ask Canadians, if you had a choice, pipeline or truck and rail, most Canadians would say, well, you know what, I feel a whole lot more confident that the crude oil will pass safely through an oil pipeline than running it by rail or by truck. Now, the safest way to transport oil, of course, is by pipeline. Specifically, rail is almost 5 times more likely to experience an accident than pipelines. Over 70% of pipeline spills result in spills of less than 1 cubic meter. Now, that is about the space of the area that I occupy here in this House of Commons. The vast majority of spills occur in facilities, within facilities, confined facilities, which generally have secondary containment mechanisms and procedures. Now, this pipeline, the Kinder Morgan pipeline, has gone through a rigorous, arguably the most rigorous science-based review that has ever been applied to any pipeline in Canada. And there have been extensive public hearings under both our former Conservative government and under the current Liberal government. In fact, the process was pretty well complete when the new Liberal government of the day said, you know what, we're going to tack on all kinds of additional criteria that are going to be reviewed, basically extending the process beyond what the proponents had expected. But they agreed, they went through that process. At the end of the process, the National Energy Board approved the project. And the approval included 157 conditions that the project would have to meet in order to receive approval. And those conditions included 49 environmental protection requirements. And the 533-page decision noted evidence that, yes, a spill in Burrard Inlet could occur, it would have adverse environmental effects, but concluded, and I quote, a large spill in Burrard Inlet is not a likely event. And both Conservatives as well as the Liberal government have determined that this project is in the national interest and must proceed, and I'll get to that in a moment. So why is this all important for Canada? And why are natural resources like oil important to our national prosperity? Well, let's not forget, Canada's resource sector writ large, that includes oil, includes gas, includes mines. That sector represents 16% of our total economy, 16%. And the resource sector directly or indirectly employs almost 2 million people across Canada. So that's 2 million people that depend on the resource sector for their livelihoods, to support their families. The Canadian government has received, on average, $25 billion of revenue from the resource sector. And if you want to focus in on oil, which of course is what the Kinder Morgan pipeline will carry, in Canada, oil is one of our most significant resources. In fact, we have the 3rd largest crude oil reserves in the whole world. We're sitting on this oil, and it's incumbent upon governments, Canadian governments, to allow that oil to be extracted in an environmentally defensible way, in a sustainable way. In 2016, natural resource companies invested over $90 billion into our economy. And we're a world leader in extracting natural resources. And we have a great comparative advantage over other countries. Why? Firstly, we have this resource, which many other countries around the world don't have. But secondly, we have the scientific knowledge, the scientific capacity to extract our oil and our gas and our other resources in the most environmentally sustainable way. Wherever you go in the world, Canada is the leader. So why would we, when we are sitting on such a large resource that can actually be extracted in an environmentally sustainable way, why would we then import oil from other countries? Which is what we do today. We import oil from other countries because we don't have the pipelines in Canada to provide for our own oil supply to our refineries, to get gas in our automobiles, and all the other products that are fired by oil. We are buying oil from countries like Saudi Arabia, Algeria, Nigeria, Venezuela. Now, do you think those countries, or Russia, do you think those countries extract their oil in the most environmentally sustainable way? Of course not, because Canada is a leader. So why would we not displace their oil with our oil by building the pipeline capacity that we need? Another reason, Mr. Speaker, why it's important that we get our pipelines to tidewater, to the ocean, is because today, when Canadian companies sell their oil on the market, the only market they have available is the North American market, where they get $25 less per barrel for their oil than the United States does, which can get its oil to market, to tidewater, to countries like China and elsewhere around the world. So why wouldn't we increase our capacity to get our product to international markets? According to the Canadian Energy Pipeline Association, this differential of $25 per barrel results in Canadians leaving $5 billion on the table every single year. Now, where does that go? Where does the opportunity go? We lose the opportunity. It's money lost from our coffers in Canada, goes to the United States, which does export its oil abroad. Think of that, $5 billion. Think of how many schools that would build in Canada, how many hospitals that would build in Canada. In fact, the Prime Minister recently said, when he was asked by a veteran why he's taking them to court, what did he say? He said, veterans are asking for more than the Liberals can give. Think of what $5 billion could do to satisfy our obligations to our veterans. So now we've got a trade war. We've got British Columbia and Alberta fighting over the Kinder Morgan pipeline. Why has that happened? I'll tell you, Mr. Speaker. It's a profound failure of federal leadership. Last week, when the trade war between those two provinces was escalating, where was our Prime Minister? Was he here in Canada? Sitting down with the provinces and stakeholders and getting this sorted out? No, he was in the United States, meeting with his friends, billionaires, selfies, hobnobbing with the rich and the famous. And this is while things are falling apart here in Canada. And Mr. Speaker, I would also suggest this. You remember when the Prime Minister was elected? One of the things he promised Canadians was he was going to usher in a new era of cooperative federalism. Remember that? Well, what's happened? It's all falling apart. We've got provinces fighting provinces. We have the federal government fighting provinces. That is not the governance that the Prime Minister promised. Another broken promise. So, Mr. Speaker, it's time for this Prime Minister to step up, take leadership, use the federal government's declaratory power, to get this project done because it's in the national interest.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Beaches East York.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the member's comments. Of course, it can't be denied that new pipelines will increase upstream emissions, and so our government, in improving this pipeline, has at the same time indicated that it's very important that we tackle the environment and climate change through pricing carbon. And I know the member is opposed to carbon pricing, so perhaps he can explain to this House how we can lower emissions at a lower possible cost than the most efficient mechanism, which is carbon pricing.
Honourable member for Abbotsford.
Well, Mr. Speaker, do you remember this term social license? Canadians were told if you place caps on emissions from the big polluters, if you impose a harmful carbon price on Canadians, what would happen? Society would provide a social license that would provide us with the ability to get pipelines built, to get resource projects built, get our oil and gas to foreign markets. And what happened in Alberta? That's exactly what they did. They put caps on emissions. They imposed a heavy carbon price on Albertans. And then, of course, Premier Notley, I'm sure, expected she would now finally have the social license that was promised her. And what did she get instead? A trade war with British Columbia. Enough said.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To my honourable colleague from Abbotsford, I wanted to address this question, which is fundamental, of why the mania for shipping out unprocessed raw bitumen as opposed to cutting off imports of more high-value crude to eastern Canadian ports. If I can, in the short amount of time for a question, put it to him that I've been advocating for some time, that we build upgraders and refineries in Alberta so that we're not shipping bitumen mixed with diluent. Bitumen is not dangerous to transport unless and until you mix it with diluent, which creates dilbit, which can't be cleaned up. We could create more jobs in Alberta more quickly and use the product in Canada by stopping the importation of about 1 million barrels a day from Kazakhstan, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, and so on. So why not refine the product in Alberta and distribute finished product across Canada for Canadians? Why the mania for export?
Member for Abbotsford.
Well, it's not an all-or-nothing situation. We want to ensure that we have pipeline capacity within Canada so we can ship our oil across the country to refineries on the East Coast. But we have so much oil that is valuable and that the world wants and which we extract in an environmentally sustainable way. Why would we not also seek export markets? And part of the problem with compelling industry to refine oil in Canada is those refineries have to have a market for it. And you're going to still have to transport that finished product somewhere. It's going to have to travel either to the West Coast or, as she suggests, to the East Coast. How is that going to happen? By truck? By rail car? It's pretty dangerous. And if you want to ship your crude abroad, the problem is countries like China that might want to buy our crude won't buy our crude because they want to refine it there in China themselves. I know that. I'm a former trade minister, and I know how this works. The Chinese don't want to buy our crude oil. They don't want to buy our refined oil. They want to buy our crude oil because they then get the chance to refine it there.
We have time for one more question. The honourable member for Burnaby South.
We've had a pretty extraordinary day today with this debate. The Natural Resources Minister was provided an opportunity to say whether or not he would use the military or police in order to push this pipeline through our province. It's something he said publicly before. He would not say that he would not do that. He would not guarantee to us that he wouldn't do that. The Minister of Infrastructure just did the same thing when asked directly whether or not he would use the Army or police. He actually went a little further and hinted that he would do this. I'm just wondering if my honourable colleague could comment on that and what he thinks of these two very, very disturbing statements. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Abbotsford.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't think Canadians are asking for the Army to be brought in to make sure that Kinder Morgan pipeline gets built. I believe what the federal government has to do is step up, sit down with the provinces, resolve this. Because the Premier of British Columbia knows that the federal government has primary jurisdiction over this. This falls within the federal government's power. The process has been completed. It was rigorous. And the project was approved with many, many conditions to ensure that it is built and operated in an environmentally sustainable way. So the suggestion that the Army would be sent in right now to resolve this problem, I think right now, I mean, it's ludicrous for us to even hypothetically suggest that would happen. Right now, you've got a dispute between two provinces where the Prime Minister should be exercising his leadership, sitting down with them and resolving the dispute. And if he can't do it, get up,